So there's the three folks that you'll be hearing from today and our contact information. We will also put this into the chat box so that you can call and email if you have questions following this presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2020 legislative session. I know it seems like it was far in our rearview mirror, but we are in fact still working through many of the crazy things that came out of that session. So here's just a couple words that came up during my thinking about the session: unprecedented, historic, extraordinary, tragic, crazy, unique, certainly one of the most unique sessions on the book. So also the longest by the time you count in the time that we were in the COVID session. So a little bit about the budget process, because this will inform much of what we talk about today. So the session convened in January, as it typically does, and about 500 bills were introduced, as they typically are. And then, of course, we went into quarantine, and the legislature did shut down from the middle of March to the end of May. So during that time, the Joint Budget Committee started running forecasting on what the budget looked like for the next year, and they came up with a hole of over $3 billion. And the first messaging that came out was like mid-April, and it was $1 billion, and then a week later it was $2 billion, and then not even short of a week later it was a $3 billion hole. So people have wondered how it got so off, and the problem is when you're trying to forecast with so many unknowns, it's really hard to land on a number. So I have also heard from all my partners and friends in the legislature that next year will be even worse, because they have pulled all the hidden tricks that they could to make this budget balance. And so next year we are looking at even deeper cuts. Although, despite the bad news, we were able to preserve the vendor fee transfer. If you'll remember from 2019, this is a transfer that came over from changing the way vendor fees are charged. We will be able to keep 6 to 8 million for housing for this year. The 30 million transfer that we also succeeded in securing last year from the Unclaimed Property Trust Fund will be delayed, but it has not been canceled. So when Allison does her slides, you'll see what that looks like for the housing budget. So although a very, very grim year for Colorado and for a lot of the programs that the people that we serve rely on, it was, housing did come through, not unscathed, but at least somewhat preserved. In just a second. So as we went through the session in the last, from the quarantine on, we were able to secure a fair amount of other housing funding. So right out of the gate, Governor Polis provided $3 million from his emergency fund that went into housing. And that was greatly, greatly appreciated. Then the federal government passed the CARES Act at the end of March, and they bumped up a lot of the existing housing programs. You can see some of the numbers there on the screen. These are programs that you all are very familiar with and have worked with. In addition, the CARES Act also provided specific rental assistance and mortgage assistance for the states. And so when we talk about House Bill 1410, that is the state legislation that allocated the federal funds into housing. So again, Allison and Jamie will talk about how those programs are actually hitting the ground. So just wanted to give you kind of an overview of what that funding looked like. So now I'm going to talk about some specific legislation that did get passed and some that didn't get passed. As I said, the legislature was not in session for a good chunk of the time that it was, in session. A lot of the bills that were introduced before COVID hit did not make it through. So the leadership said, hey, we only want to pass bills that are fast, friendly, and free. Of course, they didn't hold entirely to that, but that we did get some of those bills, but then a lot of them did not pass, and I'll sort of mention those because they could come back next year depending on where we land with our economy and with the public health situation. So some of the landlord tenant relationship bills that we were working on before COVID hit, the suppressing court records on evictions. So now these are not, you will not see evictions on people's record unless they have gone all the way through the process. So a filing of eviction doesn't show up unless it's gone all the way through. It is now also against the law to discriminate against hairstyles. We also got 2 very important mobile home park updates, and I know there's a mobile home park session today. If you're interested in that, you can go and talk about that, but some really important sort of clarifications around the bills that we passed last year, including one really interesting one that allows the residents sort of first look to purchase the park if it's going up for sale. There is the big win after session, very, very surprising, that we were able to finally get this passed, was a prohibition against discrimination on source of income. And I really, really want to thank all of you that helped out with this legislation and made calls to your legislators. This will enable us to get a lot of that new funding out into the communities, because before, as many of you know, it was a challenge to get some landlords to accept the vouchers. And so now that is no longer allowed. And then finally, landlords are not allowed to ask about citizenship status. We were able to carve out a small piece for those of you that have to ask as part of your funding stream. So those are some landlord tenant bills that passed. We also passed a couple bills around helping vulnerable populations, which a lot of you I know serve and work with. So clarify the housing assistance money that comes over from the criminal justice system that had been unclear before, and now it's a clarification. The cost of living adjustment for those who are on the Colorado Works program. This started out as a very ambitious across the board increase. Unfortunately, due to the budget cuts, this only landed on a $500 one-time transfer. They will be looking at that and that formula and that number, I think now in the off session, to see if there's a way that Colorado could raise that amount, because as you know, it's a fairly low amount for those with kids. And then finally, we were able to clarify on consent to shelter for those who are serving homeless. So those of you who work with homeless youth, this will hopefully help you give them the services that they need. Only one bill passed out of the development and construction field. Again, this was not something that made it through the pandemic. And this has to do with higher efficiencies on residential construction. So not something that is pertinent to a lot of your work, but we wanted to put it down as kind of an indication of how little work there was done in the construction area. So I'd like to turn and talk about the eviction moratorium. This did get extremely complicated, and we're still sort of under a hodgepodge of requirements. So as you know, Governor Polis on March 20th put in place a statewide eviction moratorium on evictions for non-payment. This was layered on top of the federal eviction moratorium for housing that is covered by federal subsidy. He then extended that with some various modifications through the end of the legislative session. He was really hoping that the legislature would come out with something, and they were unable to come to an agreement by the end of session. So that's why you'll see when we get to executive order number 134 or 101, he flipped from an eviction moratorium to extending the time to cure from 10 to 30 days. So if you remember last year, we extended the time to cure from 5 to 10 or 3 to 10, and now it's 10 to 30. That was extended again on July 12th, and then it was extended again last week on August 10th. So we have not been able to work with the governor on anything more comprehensive around evictions. Housing Colorado's position has always been, if you have an eviction moratorium, you have to also provide funding. And so we have the funding, and now the question is, how can we protect those folks now that unemployment has run out and the federal eviction moratorium is no longer in place. So if you want to see all the executive orders, we put the website there for you to read through them. It's a relatively complicated process. There's a lot of cross-referencing, but nonetheless, that's how a lot of legislation got made this year. The final interesting thing that came out of this legislative session was a couple of referrals to the ballot. So those of you who have been in Colorado for a while know there's two ways to get onto the ballot with an initiative. One is through gathering signatures, and one is to get referred out of the legislature. So two that came out of the legislature, one is a repeal of portions of the Gallagher Amendment. So this is the amendment that was passed in 1982. It holds commercial and residential property taxes at a 45 to 55 split. Over the years, and with Tabor, that has become increasingly unbalanced. And so now we have one of the highest commercial property tax rates in the country and one of the lowest residential. And also thanks to Tabor, with the ratchet effect, with the COVID crisis, it looks like that residential property rate will drop even lower from 7.1% to about 5.8%. So this really hurts a lot of your local communities that rely on these funds for their fire and their water, their library districts, their police districts. we are unsure about the impact on housing, about what this would actually do for folks' property taxes. One of the challenges is because of the single subject, this amendment undoes Gallagher, but it doesn't provide a replacement formula, and so it's a little unclear what would happen if this does pass. So something to look forward to on your ballot. The other one that's also kind of popped out of nowhere for us was the cigarette, tobacco, and nicotine products tax. So right now, vaping products are not taxed because they weren't invented when this was first passed. So this bill rolls vaping and raises the tax on all nicotine products, and does allocate over $11 million each year into the Housing Development Grant Fund. And then another additional $500,000 into the Eviction Legal Defense Fund. So also something to look for on your ballot this year. So whatever happened to anti-growth? I know we were all talking about this for starting last year around this time. The anti-growth initiative that would have capped growth on the 11 Front Range counties did get pulled due to COVID and the inability of the sponsor to get signatures. I will guarantee you that this will be back. So we put together a nice coalition of housing, environmental, and consumer protection groups before it got pulled. And we are ready and able to pull that coalition back out again when this rears its head. So that's where anti-growth is. So finally, I just want to touch really briefly on federal housing action. We talked about the CARES Act and the kind of money that came out of that with the temporary eviction moratorium that was signed into law on the 27th of March. The next bill that rolled out of the House was the HEROES Act. It also had some really interesting housing elements to it. It did not make it out of the Senate, and they are not considering it. They had a companion bill that also did not make it. So there's currently no federal action. The other interesting bill that passed out of the House was an Infrastructure Act that finally would have fixed our 4%. Increase the per capita on the 9%, give some really important boosts to areas that need additional housing support, and lower the 50% bond test. So this did pass out of the House, but it did not pass out of the Senate. So there is my contact information if you have any questions, and I will turn it over to Allison.